Over the past few days, we've seen quite the influx of new information and new hype concerning Gran Turismo 7, which isn't too surprising given that we had a couple of variations of the trailer, initially in the live stream, then on its own. Even Porsche released their own variation of a trailer, and it's not too surprising that we're starting to get more info, given that March 2022, if the game does stick to that release, is only really just around the corner. And now Kaz himself has shed even more light on certain issues or potential questions that we may have, thanks to the trailer, or thanks to other news that we already had, such as recently on the channel where I talked about the confirmation that it will be releasing on both the PS4 and the PS5. Now that immediately raised some potential issues, justified concerns, and he actually touched on that point. Because, to quote the man himself, he says, technology-wise, it's a very scalable game in terms of maintaining the frame rate and everything else. We found that we were able to make a PS4 version and a PS5 version without dropping any quality. So that's why we decided to do both at the same time. Now, the main difference, according to his quote, is of course the loading times. Now, even as far as frame rates go, he said that it is going to be the same on both consoles, and that is another thing that people had issue with, but he said that the primary difference that you'll notice is that loading time. And he went on to use the example of loading an event. PS5 users will load up an event very quickly in, for example, an online lobby, and they'll have more of a chance to jump into the practice, etc. Whereas a PS4 user, using that cross-generation play, which is going to be there, PS4 versus PS5 players, you'll have to wait a little bit longer to load it up and have a little bit less time. Is that fair? Well, of course, it depends on which console you choose to play it on, so I would say that's fair given that if you do decide to stick to the PS4, you're sacrificing a bit of loading time, but you're also saving a lot of money. The next point which he touched on was actually regarding the PS5's controller in particular. And the main thing which stood out to me was actually that, according to him, the new precision of the PS5 pad, for those of us who do play with a controller, such as myself, I definitely prefer it over a wheel. He actually said that the PS5 controller now equals the precision of a wheel. And that's thanks in part to people like Fraga and Hizal, who have helped. For those who don't know, those are like the FIA finalists, the best of the best within Gran Turismo's esports side, who have helped to tune the system and make it even better than GT Sport was. Next up, he spoke about the online experience. Now, he said that everything that GT Sport has in that online sense is going to be carried over, including 16-player events. However, the fact that online saving has been carried over has been a bit of an issue for some people. Some people have made comments, I believe there were some even here on the channel on those breakdown videos, that people weren't really happy about that, even though GT Sport had it anyway. Now, I will admit, comparing that to an older way of saving a game does seem initially annoying, but it wasn't really that much of an issue in my experience. You'd have the occasional outage, but generally, if you've got bad internet, that's the only time it's going to be a huge issue. Is that fair? Not for those people, and that's a justified point. For most of us, it probably won't be too much of an issue. And for any who are curious about why they make that choice, according to Kaz at least, there are two primary reasons. One is actually to reduce the amount of people cheating within the game, such as modding saves, where they can more easily track somebody who's had an inexplicable jump in money for no apparent reason, I presume, or maybe just adding cars using mods or whatever. Reducing that is always a great thing, especially when the game really hinges on the online experience, as GT Sport, for example, does. Having cheats or mods, it just doesn't work in an esports game. You cannot allow for that kind of thing, for obvious reasons. In an old school game where it's just you versus the AI, then sure, I'm personally all for that. Cheat codes, get them all in there, it's all cool. But one-on-one real people, of course, that doesn't fly. The secondary reason for that online saving, he actually referenced being liveries. Saving all of those livery collections, ones that you've downloaded, ones that you've made yourself, possibly vinyl groups maybe as well. Saving all of that kind of stuff online is the way that it's going to be done, just like it was in GT Sport as well. Next up, we have something which of course a lot of us are interested in, and that is the physics. I spoke briefly earlier on about how the controller is going to be closer to the kind of precision that you can get with a wheel, equaling it according to Kaz. The physics, though, he said, are specifically aiming to be more natural, even than GT Sport was. So for those who are perhaps worried, and I'm sure there are some people who are, maybe weren't a fan of the way GT Sport felt compared to previous games. And even for me, GT Sport is not my favourite Gran Turismo when it comes to the physics. That would be probably easily 5, to be honest, is my favourite. But that's because I tend to favour the fun with a little bit of realism rather than just hardcore real. Apparently GT7 is having a little bit more of a user-friendly approach, while still having enough of a sim approach, doubtless based on certain settings you choose as well, to still be a serious esports contender, as of course Kaz is ever interested in. Including in that physics and simulation side of the discussion is weather simulation. Kaz refers to it much more as a simulation than just changeable weather, quote unquote. Because it is going to be more than just, oh, there's a bit of rain on the track. There's going to be changeable ambient temperatures, changeable track temperatures, changeable humidity, water spray from the wheels going off the track, etc., and properly interacting with vehicles. So, proper weather, active weather. And a couple of people pointed out that in my breakdown, I can't recall which one it was, I think it may have been the 12 extra things that you might have missed in the trailer, I mentioned the active weather still being included, and that's why I didn't mention it. Of course, I was technically incorrect there, where I said that weather was already in GT Sport. I was right and wrong, because what I meant by that is that changeable weather was already in the game, which it was. But what I said in that video, and what people were actually looking forward to, is the dynamic weather, which of course was not in that game, wherein it can change during an event. And that, just to clarify, and this is something which Kaz was talking about here as well, is present in GT7. The weather and the time of day will be changeable during the event itself, and you will be able to, again, according to him, change the speed of time progression, much like we could in, for example, Gran Turismo 6. And just to clarify again, for those who are perhaps wondering, he did confirm not all circuits are going to have active weather and time of day. So that is something to bear in mind. I suspect, as you would assume, that most of that effort is going to go into the real-world circuits. I suspect that they'll probably have some changeable weather on some of the returning iconic tracks. I wouldn't be, for example, surprised if we had changeable weather on Deep Forest or Trial Mountain, maybe even both, maybe High Speed Ring. And I don't recall if we've seen that or not in a trailer. You could just as easily go the other way and not have it, but I could see them doing that for nostalgia's sake. On the other hand, tracks like the Nürburgring, Lassart, of course they're going to get first dibs. Next up, he made some interesting points regarding the performance points system, the PP system, as we like to call it. PewDiePie would approve, no doubt. This is interesting because it is a change from the previous performance points that were initiated in GT5, for the most part, then you could say refined in GT6, but it had its issues. You know, the Red Bull Junior is always the one that stands out for me. There's no way it should have been higher than a Chaparral 2J. That was ridiculous. But the new system works in an entirely different way, because much like GT6's point system, it had its flaws. GT Sports system definitely had its flaws as well, flaws which I've pointed out here on the channel in numerous car reviews and other videos, wherein having an arbitrary power-based system just doesn't work. For the same reason why the Red Bull Junior having such a high PP ranking doesn't work either. Just because it's technically super light and a race car with a lot of downforce doesn't mean it's all that fast if it doesn't have the power to back it up. Likewise, having a huge amount of power, well, you could have two N700 cars, two N1000 cars, each are radically different, but they just happen to have the same amount of power. You know, technically, the Jay Leno tank car would be an N900, N1000 car. Wouldn't stand a chance against a LaFerrari or a Veyron, though, so it's not really that accurate of a system. So what they've done, as we saw from those trailers, is bring the points back. But interestingly, the older system was, as we would assume, a calculation-based thing, which is why sometimes it would be inaccurate. I personally believe for the most part it was pretty good. Now, it's interesting because it might make tuning a little bit more challenging. We might not have as much of an edge for people like myself who like to do tune setups and give people that little bit of an extra edge, because the way the new system works is actually simulation-based. So each setting that you change, again, according to Kaz at least, is going to have an internal simulation within the game of what the game now shows your car can do based on what you've changed. With the obvious example being changing gear ratios. So that could mean that this may possibly be one of those times where something like a gear ratio giving you more top-end speed may actually increase the performance points of a car. That will initially ruffle some feathers. I'm not necessarily opposed to that though, because that is accurate. At the end of the day, if you have two cars, once again like the N-Class system, but you tune one to have a much longer final drive, well, on a track like Route X or La Sarthe, you're going to have an advantage if it's just got a way better top-end speed, even if it has the same power. So I'm not opposed to the idea of that being done. But tell me your thoughts on that aspect down below, and balance of performance, he does confirm, is still going to be a part of the game, doubtless more so in the esports side, but maybe in some career mode events, missions, whatever. He next moves on to what a lot of us have been excited for, the modifications, the customization, wide body kits, rear wings, changeable license plates, etc. All of this stuff that we've covered on the channel, and he actually confirmed that this is more than just a coincidental homage. It is 100% a direct reference back to Gran Turismo 1, he references in particular. For me, I always used to remember this from Gran Turismo 2, because that's where I started in the series. Stuff like turning the Lotus Elise GT1 road car into the iconic black and yellow racing version, turning the pink or purple TVR Speed 12 into the iconic blue and white racing version, etc., etc., and sometimes making some crazy creations like NASCARs and drag cars, as many of you who are fans of the older games like myself will remember. Now, these may not be quite that extreme, but he has said that they are a definite nod back to that and that they are very fun to use. He also dropped another interesting little tidbit that we will be able to add roll cages to cars as well. So that's an interesting new feature that we're going to be able to actually see the difference with, and doubtless that will have a change on performance as well. And I am curious to see how these mods factor into those performance points as well. And last but definitely not least, he actually talked about the GT Cafe, and this is something which we've wondered about. Certain people had theories. He's basically clarified that by saying it's essentially a place to talk about cars, keep the knowledge of cars going for the next generation, and to be kind of like what Forza does with the Auto Vistas. When it was first introduced in Forza 4 with Clarkson talking about the cars, this time it's that kind of Gran Turismo history section that used to be in the game, where you could read a few paragraphs about each car that had a lot of love and attention put into each vehicle, giving it its real-world backstory of what the car was notable for, what it offers, what it's maybe good or bad for, and in many ways it kind of inspires a lot of the stuff that I do here on the channel, and even some of the way that I review cars. And in effect, on a fairly large scale, I am living proof that this kind of thing is important, because I was inspired from childhood playing games like this in Forza to now do what I'm doing on the channel. I now talk about these games, and I talk about real cars, Ferraris, Maseratis, Porsches, etc. in the real world. But I talk about them almost in the way that you would a Gran Turismo car, in some cases. So I'm living proof that this kind of thing is hugely important. Not just from a historical perspective, which I think GT Sport got it a little bit wrong. It made it a little bit too much about the history, with a lot of unnecessary stuff like, as I said before on the channel, what kind of wristwatch Margaret Thatcher wore. Nobody cares. But if it's about the car, well, then we do. That is what engenders that passion in the next generation, and is also, of course, hugely nostalgic for those of us who did play the older ones. And that actually ties into pretty much Kaz's final point, which is that nostalgia is hugely important in this game. It inspired a lot of it. I recall an interview or something that he gave a while back where he was at one of the esports events, I believe, and he noticed even a lot of the younger players playing PS1s and PS2s on these older Gran Turismo games which he didn't play anymore, but he noticed the amount of love that they still had. And when they started mining those older games to potentially update and bring back nostalgic elements, they found that they could quite easily make a really good game. And if you check out some of the older videos that I've done, and even some of the more recent ones, along with many of the thoughts that a lot of you guys have as well, we want that. And so the market is most definitely there. I believe that Gran Turismo 7 is going to be very successful, especially now that it's cross-gen. So overall, that's it for Kaz's interview. Certainly a lot of great new information and clarification. So give me your thoughts down below. As I always say with these, of course stick around here on the channel. Subscribe with the bell in particular, ideally. Otherwise YouTube won't show you the new vids to see more information like this as we get closer to the game's release. And of course, you can bet your backside I'm going to be doing a whole lot of Gran Turismo 7 content when it is released. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.